The notice from St. Michael's Hospital arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Bad news always came on Tuesdays. Vera Quinn had been a nursing student for 3 years, working double shifts at a 24-hour pharmacy on Bloor Street just to keep her apartment in Parkdale. A one-bedroom she shared with a fold-out couch and a radiator that made sounds like someone's was trying to escape from inside it. The notice informed her in clean administrative language that her clinical placement had been reassigned due to staffing restructuring, which was a polite way of saying the department head, Dr. Fennick, had given her spot to someone whose father sat on the hospital board. She'd known it was coming, hadn't wanted to believe it. She stood in the pharmacy stockroom on her break, reading the email a second time on her phone, then a third. The fluorescent light above her flickered. The radiator at home would have felt less out of place here. That night, she picked up an extra shift covering the overnight counter. The pharmacy stayed open until 2 a.m. on weekdays, and the overnight hours were always the strangest. The insomniacs, the new parents, the people who'd driven 20 minutes just to buy cold medicine because they didn't want to be alone with how awful they felt. At 11:47, the door opened and a man came in. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Vera's rent for 3 months, but he was moving like something was wrong. One hand pressed flat against his side, the other gripping the doorframe for just a moment before he let go. He straightened when he saw her looking, pretended he hadn't needed that doorframe at all. "I need gauze," he said. "Tensor bandage. Antiseptic." Vera looked at him steadily. "Are you injured?" "I need gauze," he repeated. His voice was the kind that didn't leave room for follow-up questions. She came around the counter without another word. She'd been a pharmacy student long enough to recognize someone who was bleeding under their shirt, and she'd been alive long enough to know that some people didn't call ambulances for reasons that weren't any of her business. She walked him to the first aid aisle, pulled what she needed from the shelves, then looked at him. "The staff bathroom is in the back," she said. "I'm going to help you." He didn't argue, which told her more than the suit or the careful posture or the hand pressed to his side. The fact that he didn't argue told her he was worse off than he wanted her to see. His name was Rafferty Cole. She didn't know that yet. What she knew, in the white light of a pharmacy stockroom just before midnight, was that there was a gash along his left side that had gone through his shirt and probably needed stitches, that he was holding himself still with the practiced calm of someone who'd been hurt before and hadn't fallen apart about it, and that his eyes, when he finally looked at her directly, were a very dark grey and gave away nothing at all. She cleaned the wound. She taped it properly. She told him he needed a hospital, and he said, "I know," in the tone of a man who had no intention of going to one. She wrapped his ribs anyway. 2 of them were cracked, she was almost certain, and handed him a bottle of ibuprofen. "How much?" he said. "For what? For this?" He gestured, vaguely, at the general situation. "The supplies are $12.63, she said. The rest was just common decency. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind those grey eyes too quick to name. He paid for the supplies, tucked the bag under his arm, and walked out into the February cold without another word. She didn't expect to see him again. She was wrong. 3 days later, her clinical placement was reinstated. The email came from the department administrator, not Dr. Fennick. It was terse and offered no explanation. Vera read it twice, then called the school, then called the hospital, and no one could quite explain why the decision had been reversed. Only that it had been, and her spot in the cardiac unit was waiting for her starting Monday. She thought about it on the walk home, thought about grey eyes and a measured voice asking for gauze. Decided she was reading too much into things. She was not reading too much into things. The second time she saw Rafferty Cole, it was at the hospital. She was in the corridor outside the cardiac unit 20 minutes before the end of her first week when she turned a corner and nearly walked into him. He was in a different suit, charcoal this time, no blood, and he was talking to the hospital's chief administrator, Mr. Aldbridge, with the easy authority of someone who had never in his life waited to be acknowledged. Aldbridge was nodding rapidly, A man in his 60s who had spent 30 years learning how to be the most important person in any room was nodding the way people nodded at Rafferty Cole. Cole saw her. Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. It was more like recognition, the way a chess player looks when a piece moves where they expected it to. He excused himself from Aldbridge and walked over. "Nurse Quinn," he said. She had never told him her last name. It was on her name badge, she realized. Still, "Mr. Cole," she said. "How's the placement?" She held his gaze. "Reinstated, it turns out. Good hospitals need good nurses." "They do," she said carefully. "Did you have something to do with that?" He tilted his head just slightly. "I have a board seat. Occasionally I weigh in on administrative matters." A pause. "You were good with your hands." It was a clinical observation. She recognized it as one because she'd said the same kind of thing herself about good surgeons, about nurses who could hit a vein on the first try. Still, something in the way he said it made her pay attention. "Thank you," she said. "For? If that's what happened." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You didn't ask for anything." He left. Aldbridge appeared at his elbow immediately, as though tethered to him by a string. Vera stood in the corridor for a moment, her stethoscope cold against her chest, and thought that she should probably be more unsettled by this than she was. The problem was that she wasn't unsettled at all. She was something else, a feeling she didn't have a clean word for yet. Careful interest, maybe. The way you felt the first time you held a patient's chart and realized it was more complicated than you'd expected. She thought about it on the bus home. She thought about it in the pharmacy on Friday's overnight shift when the door didn't open and Rafferty Cole didn't walk in. She thought about it more than was reasonable and told herself it was because the situation was strange and not because of anything else. The third time was not accidental. He came into the pharmacy on a Wednesday evening. A reasonable hour, 7 o'clock, the kind of time people came in for cough syrup and contact lens solution. But Rafferty Cole did not browse. He came directly to the counter, looked at her in the same way he'd looked at her that first night, like he was reading something and making decisions about it, and said, "Are you free on Saturday?" "That depends," Vera said. "On what Saturday involves?" "Dinner," he said, "to say thank you." "Properly. You already said you didn't need to be thanked." "I'm revising my position." She should have said no. There were 100 sensible reasons to say no, beginning with the fact that she didn't know this man, didn't know what he did or who he was to the people at that hospital, didn't know why he'd come in bleeding through his shirt at midnight with no intention of explaining himself. He was a board member at St. Michael's. He wore suits that cost more than her tuition payments. He had grey eyes that didn't give anything away for free. "Saturday's fine," she said. It was not a sensible decision. She made it anyway. His name was Rafferty Cole, and he was, as she came to understand it, piece by piece, over the following weeks, the kind of man that certain other men were afraid of. He told her some of it himself over that first dinner at a restaurant in Yorkville where the menus had no prices. He told her he had what he called business interests in construction, in port logistics, in a private investment firm that had offices in 3 cities. He told her these things carefully, the way you'd hand something fragile to a person you weren't sure yet had steady hands. She listened the same way, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. He did not tell her, that first night, about the other things. She learned about those later. The scar along his left side was not the first. She could tell that the evening she saw him without his jacket, there were older marks, the kind that came from a life that had involved decisions that couldn't be taken back. The men who sometimes waited in black SUVs outside the restaurant, outside his building, were not his drivers. They were something else, the calls he stepped away to take, brief and quiet, in a language that was sometimes English and sometimes not. Those were something else too. She was a nursing student from Parkdale. She was 26 years old. She had $93 in her checking account on payday before her loan payment cleared, and a radiator that still sounded like it was trying to get out. And she was, despite every reasonable reservation, spending her Sundays with a man who ran something that the people in his orbit approached the way you'd approach something that could bite. She didn't look away from it. She didn't pretend it wasn't there. That was the thing Rafferty Cole seemed to notice about her. Not her competence with gauze and tensor bandage, though he'd noticed that too. What he noticed was that she looked at things directly, that she didn't perform a reaction she didn't feel. Most people, he told her one evening, in his apartment near the waterfront, where the city spread out in lights below them, decide how they feel about me before they know anything. I don't have enough data yet, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh properly, not the measured, controlled version he used in public, but something actual. It made him look different. Younger, maybe, or just less like a man who'd spent years arranging his face into something unreadable. She filed it away. The way she filed everything. For later, when she'd know what it meant. The thing that changed everything happened in March on a night when Vera was working a late shift at the hospital. She was in the cardiac unit, 40 minutes from the end of her shift, when a man was brought in through emergency. He wasn't her patient. She heard the commotion from down the corridor, something fast-moving, a stretcher, 3 men in dark coats who shouldn't have been past the security desk and somehow were. She stepped back and stayed out of the way you learn to do when situations got complicated. Then one of the men in dark coats grabbed the nurse at the desk, grabbed her by the arm, roughly, demanding a doctor, and Vera moved without deciding to. "Let go of her," she said. The man looked at her. He was large and expressionless, and had the look of someone who expected things to move when he applied pressure. "I said let go of her," Vera repeated, "or I will have security here in 30 seconds, and then we'll have a very long conversation about whether your colleague on that stretcher gets care at all." Something shifted. Maybe it was her voice, flat and clinical. The voice she used when a patient was in pain and panic was the least useful option. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't step back. He released the nurse's arm. The nurse, to her credit, stepped smoothly behind the desk and paged security anyway. The man on the stretcher was named Hawkins. He was one of Rafferty Cole's. She understood that within the first 20 minutes, when Rafferty arrived at the hospital with his jaw tight and his coat over a shirt he'd clearly put on in a hurry, he saw her standing near the trauma bay and stopped. "Vera, he's stable," she said. "For now. Are you going to tell me what happened?" "No. Then I'm going to tell you something instead." She turned to face him fully. "The man who grabbed my colleague is still in the waiting room. If he touches another person in this hospital, I'll make sure the conversation that follows involves people whose job it is to ask questions you don't want to answer." Rafferty Cole looked at her for a long moment. The tightness in his jaw didn't go away, but something behind his eyes shifted. Respect, she thought, or maybe something more complicated than that. "I'll speak to him," he said. "Good. Vera." He said her name differently this time. Not to get her attention. Just her name, the way you'd say something you weren't sure you were allowed to. "I'm sorry. For this. That it came here." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just handle it." She went back to work. Her hands were completely steady. She'd known by then most of the shape of it. Not all the details. She'd been careful not to ask questions she wasn't ready for. But the general architecture. Rafferty Cole moved in a world where the rules were different, where loyalty was the currency that mattered most, where the men in darks outside the restaurants were not incidental. He was not a cruel man. He was not the thing that certain stories made people like him into. But he was not without blood on his hands either, and she'd have been lying to herself if she hadn't understood that. The question she'd been sitting with for weeks was not whether she understood it. It was whether she could live with it, whether she could be a person whose hands healed people for a living, and also love a man whose world ran on a different kind of force. It wasn't a simple answer. She didn't pretend it was. What she came back to every time was this. She'd looked at Rafferty Cole directly from the first night. She'd never looked away. And what she'd seen, under the suits and the grey eyes and the men who waited in black SUVs, was someone who had chosen, in every small moment she'd observed, to be careful with people who couldn't defend themselves. He'd been careful with her from the beginning. He'd given her nothing she hadn't chosen to take. That didn't make it simple. It made it true. In April, the situation deteriorated. She found out about it not from Rafferty, but from a man named Dempsey, grey-haired, soft-spoken, who appeared at the pharmacy one Thursday evening and introduced himself as Rafferty's legal counsel. He told her, with the careful neutrality of a man who had spent decades delivering unwelcome news, that Rafferty was facing a credible threat from a former associate named Blaine Strick, who had for some months been working to dismantle Cole's operations from the inside. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because Mr. Cole wouldn't," Dempsey said, "and because the threat may extend to people connected to him." She went home and sat on her fold-out couch with the coat still on and thought about the radiator. It was quiet tonight. It had been quiet for a week, actually. Rafferty had sent someone to look at it without being asked, after she'd mentioned it once in passing. She'd meant to be annoyed about that. She hadn't managed it. She called him. "Dempsey came to see me," she said when he picked up. A long pause. "He disagreed with you. He was right." She kept her voice even. "Talk to me." He did. It was the most she'd ever heard him say in one conversation. Not because he was naturally quiet, she understood now, but because he'd spent years learning that words were expensive in his world, and you didn't spend them unless you had to. He told her about Strick, about what Strick had taken, about what it would mean if the situation played out the way it was heading. "There's a meeting next week," he said. "I'm going to end it then." "How?" "The only way things like this end." She didn't ask him to clarify. She said, "Is there anything you need from me before then?" Another pause, longer this time. "You shouldn't be involved, Rafferty." She said his name the way he said hers sometimes. Just the name, with what it carried. "I'm already involved. That's not a complaint. It's a fact. What do you need?" he told her. There was a file, a medical file, that Strick had acquired through the hospital, a file that contained information about one of Cole's associates that Strick intended to use as leverage. It was in the system. Vera had access to the system in her clinical capacity. If the file could be flagged as improperly accessed, because Strick had gotten it through someone inside the records department who had since been identified, it could be pulled from admissibility before the meeting. "That's not illegal," she said, working through it. "Flagging an improperly accessed file. No." He said, "It's not. I can do that." She could. She did. She flagged the file, documented the improper access, submitted the report to hospital compliance with her name on it. It took her 40 minutes and her hands were steady the whole time. The meeting happened on a Wednesday. She was working a shift at the pharmacy, and she spent most of it trying not to watch the clock. At 11:10, her phone buzzed. "It's done." And then, a minute later, "Everyone is well." She let out a breath she'd been holding since April. He came to the pharmacy at closing time. He looked tired in a way she'd never seen before. Not the controlled tiredness he usually wore, but something actual, something that had gone deeper than surface. He stood on the other side of the counter and looked at her, and she looked back. "Strick," she said, no longer a concern. She nodded. "And your people?" "All accounted for." She came around the counter. She'd made a decision somewhere in the last few weeks, maybe on the night at the hospital when she'd told the man in the dark coat to let go, or maybe before that, or maybe in increments. The way most real decisions actually happened. She'd made it and she was at peace with it. "Come on," she said. "I'll make tea. You look terrible." Something crossed his face. The same thing she'd seen that first night when she'd handed him the ibuprofen and told him the rest was common decency. It was gratitude, she thought, but it was also something underneath gratitude, the specific relief of a person who had spent a long time bracing for people to leave. "I'm told I look considerably worse than terrible," he said. "You do," she confirmed. "Come anyway." They walked back to her apartment in Parkdale, through the April cold, past the all-night convenience stores and the late buses pulling away from the curb. Her building was 4 floors of indifferent brick. The elevator had been broken for 6 weeks. The stairwell smelled like takeout and something that might have been mildew. Rafferty Cole walked up 3 flights of stairs in a suit that cost more than her rent without comment. She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table, the small one with the wobbly leg she'd fixed with a folded matchbook, and she watched him as she waited for the kettle begin to unspool just slightly. Not to collapse, nothing dramatic, just his shoulders dropped a fraction. His hands resting on the table opened. "The hospital," he said. "The placement thing. I should have told you that was me. I knew it was you. You didn't say anything. I figured you'd tell me eventually." She paused. "I was right." He looked at her hands for a moment and then at her. "You flagged that file. It needed flagging. It was my name to put on it." She set his tea in front of him. "I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to." A pause. "I'm saying that no one has ever." He stopped, tried again. "The people in my world understand what I am. They work with it or around it. You're the first person I've met in a long time who looked at it and decided to be part of it anyway, on your own terms." Vera sat down across from him. The radiator, which had been silent for a month, let out one tentative clang from the corner, like it was checking in. She ignored it. "I'm a nursing student from Parkdale," she said. "I work 2 jobs and my elevator's been broken for 6 weeks. I'm not under any illusions that what you do is simple." "No," he said. "You're not. But I looked at you and I decided you were worth knowing." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I don't make that decision carelessly." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. "Vera Quinn," he said finally. And it was different from every other time he'd said her name. Not the name badge version, not the careful version, the actual one. "Don't make it dramatic," she said. "Drink your tea." He did. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, buses and sirens and the low hum of 1,000,000 people getting on with it. The radiator knocked once more and went silent. In the spring, when her placement hours were complete and she passed her exams with marks that made her program supervisor do a slight double take, Rafferty Cole shook her hand formally at the pharmacy and told her, in front of 2 customers and her co-worker Bet, that St. Michael's had approved a full nursing scholarship in her name, conditional on her continued enrollment. She looked at him. "Completely above board," he said. "Board approved it unanimously. You can verify." "I will verify," she said. "I know," he said, and there it was again, that thing underneath the thing, the specific look of a man who had spent a long time being surprised and was trying to figure out if he was allowed to stop bracing for it. She verified it that evening. It was completely above board. She called him when she was done and said, "You're impossible." "You've managed me so far," he said. "I have," she agreed. "Don't push it." There was a pause, and in the pause was everything that had accumulated since February. The pharmacy, the hospital corridor, the tea at her wobbly kitchen table, the decisions she'd made with her name on them and her hand steady, the city outside doing what it always did. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No performance. No careful management. "You're welcome," she said. Just that back. She hung up and stood in her kitchen in Parkdale, and the radiator was quiet, and the city was loud, and she was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she meant to be.